Hello, I'm SB Moores, and today I have a little bit of a switch up from the normal videos I make. I have made videos exclusively about two different book series so far, The Black Company and Malazan. But I'm also more of a fan of other fantasy works as well. I've read the first three of the Stormlight Archive books, and I've also read Elantris and Warbreaker. I have read the prequel Driss trilogy books, and I've read Mort by Terry Pratchett. That's a great book. And I'll probably make a video about that very soon. You might be able to tell since I just had the copy on hand here. But today, what I wanted to make a video about is something that I read in basically 3 days, very short works, translations actually, by J.R.R. Tolkien of three old English poems. We have Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is kind of the main um, portion of this omnibus edition. I mean, that's pretty short for an omnibus edition. I mean, one of these is only 20 pages. Pearl and Sir Orfeo, which I did a little bit of researching, and I also read the foreword by Christopher Tolkien, his son, or the introduction, or maybe the preface it was. But I believe they mentioned that we don't actually know who the author of these three poems was, and we actually don't know for sure if all three were written by the same person, but it's highly likely based off of the way they're written, um, as well as the fact that they're all found together in one manuscript or book. But these are translations into modern English without the original translation side by side. I can't read Old English or Middle English, so that wouldn't give me anything. But I do have the main reason I wanted to read this was for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This is going to be full spoilers for all three of these. I'll probably talk a lot about the Green Knight, pretty decent bit about Sir Orfeo, and very little about Pearl. But I will talk about all three. Um, but I am a little bit of a fan of Arthurian legend. I know a little bit. I haven't read. I think it's Lemort the author or something like that. I probably just butchered that pronunciation, but I have heard of it. I haven't read it. I read, even though it's not part of the original or any, I guess technically, Arthurian legend canon. I read T.H. White's The Once and Future King when I was in middle school, and um, ashamed as I am to admit it, I play a very, very terrible game called Smite, Battleground of the Gods. And I played a lot of King Arthur in that game. So, not that that gives me any special knowledge on anything about Arthurian legend, but I was very interested in reading Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, being part of Arthurian legend, as well as for the fact that a few years ago I watched a movie published by produced by A24 or published by them or produced or some such thing, um, based off of the Green Knight, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and it was just called the Green Knight. I believe it's mentioned also at the beginning of this, and is possibly common knowledge, that these titles given to these poems are not actually the titles that they're given, because they are not given titles in the original manuscript. They're just written down. But they're pretty apt, I'd say, for the three, based off how they are. But this is going to be full spoilers for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Pearl, and Sir Orfeo, if I didn't already say that. But to start things off with, just in general, I don't really read a lot of poetry. The most poetry that I've ever read is what's in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series, because there's a lot of epigraphs with a lot of poems in that series. And I've read the very first part of Gormenghast, by Mervyn Peake, and there's a poem in that about a cake. And I remember I have read, a little bit of Edgar Allan Poe. I remember I did a school project on Tu Ulalame when I was younger. I say younger, that was like 2 or 3 years ago, not even. Um, but other than that, my reading on poetry is not very deep at all. It's not really my preferred medium. I do enjoy it, but more so when it's relating to a fantasy work, because that's really my whole shtick. Is I read a lot of fantasy and a little bit of sci-fi on the side. I have a lot of sci-fi books that I haven't read, but a lot of fantasy books I haven't read. But I've definitely read a lot more fantasy. Um, and I think that this is honestly a perfect thing to read if you're into fantasy, even if you're not particularly a fan of poetry, because Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, though not being a prose work, honestly could kind of be read like one. That's very unscholarly of me to say, I bet. And I'm sure that there are some Arthurian scholars that are rolling their eyes. That just from me saying that, they don't even know that I said it. They just sensed something in the air about the ignoble words I just gave about it. But really, I think if you're just a fan of fantasy, you could read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And I think one of the most interesting things about reading up on Arthurian legend or anything like that is that fantasy as a genre really stems from these works that we have. It stems from ancient cultures and their religions and a lot of what's in modern day religion as well. I believe Narnia is a very Christian centric or is very much inspired by Christianity, I think. I'm not quite sure. I've never read Narnia. I'm pretty sure this might be spoilers for Narnia, but I've heard that the lion is supposed to be an analogy to Jesus, or he is Jesus. Um, I'm not quite sure. I'm not very learned on anything in Christianity or Narnia. But those are Christianity is very prevalent in all three of these poems. And religion. But, fantasy really goes back to the myths that were created when, culture and society started to, and civilization started to form throughout the world. And, I believe that as much as fantasy is very, very different nowadays with people creating their own worlds and whatnot, it really all stems from these artifacts from the past, and it's the beginning of the genre. A lot of people like to say that Tolkien invented modern fantasy, and that's very true for, creating your own world and mythos and legendarium and whatnot and writing about it. But fantasy as a genre has existed for, since the Middle Ages and even well before that, and it I guess what is fantastical is also dependent upon what you believe. So, like the ancient civilizations between the Tigris and the Euphrates didn't really, I would assume, believe that their gods were fantastical because they were just real. They were just part of the world. Um, but, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself because I don't think that the Gawain poet really thought that Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was a real event. It's a work that he made to add to Arthurian myth, and it's still spoken about today. And the fact that it's still translated today is very cool. Um, to start off with the Green Knight, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the whole concept itself of the wounding game was very interesting to me. I don't know if it was like a real thing that had ever occurred in Great Britain or anywhere in Europe throughout the Middle Ages, but the whole idea that we're in Camelot and King Arthur is sitting there with his court and members of the Round Table, which is so cool to read an authentic thing about it. Um, and then just this knight made out of foliage almost just comes up, starts besmirching everybody's honor with these comments, and then riles King Arthur up, and then Gawain and all his chivalry goes up, and it's like, please, sir, let me do this instead. And I think there's a little time to mention the way in which the actual poem of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is written, because I very much enjoyed it, and I've never read any poetry that was like this, especially because it's written in. I've heard that I researched very minorly about the kind of poem that this was, And I heard that it was part of a failed revival that was happening, the alliteration revival. Um, so using the same consonant or syllable or over and over again. So like the poem starts out with, just to give you an idea, um, that doesn't really do a good job. The second line will make sense, but I'll read the first. When the siege and assault had ceased at Troy, and the fortress fell in flame and firebrands and ashes. So, and the fortress fell in flame to firebrands. That's a lot of alliteration going on. And you'll have a lot of lines that go like that, like a whole stanza, and then it ends with something that's called the bob and wheel, which I really enjoyed, and I think it gave a lot of flavor to the text. Every stanza will end in a very short line that I believe is has one stress, I think is what it is. So for this, it ends in. I'll just read the full first stanza in Bow and Wheel of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, so you can get a gist of what it's like if you haven't read it. When the siege and the assault had ceased at Troy, and the fortress fell in flame to firebrands and ashes, the traitor who the contrivance of treason there fashioned was tried for his treachery, the most true upon earth. It was Aeneas, the noble and his renowned kindred, who then laid under them lands, and lords became, of well nigh all the wealth in the western isles. When royal Romulus to Rome his road had taken, in great pomp and pride he peopled it first, and named it with his own name that yet now it bears. Tyrius went to Tuscany and towns founded, Langobard in Lombardy uplifted halls, and far over the French flood Felix Brutus on many a broad bank in brave Britain established, full fair. And that's the bottom. Where strange things, strife and sadness, had whiles in the landed fair, and each other grieved grief and gladness, oft fast have followed there. And then that's the wheel. It's a four lines that have um, every other line rhymes, and it really adds a lot of flavor to the text. And I think it's so enjoyable, and it's actually pretty fun to read, and it really lets you chug through this. I mean, when you're reading, when you're just going fa 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 or wah 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 ba ba ba. It's that sounded stupid, but with that alliteration, it really kind of rolls off the tongue. Every now and again, there will be a little bit of a jarring line, but we don't have a word that starts with a specific letter for every single emotion and action and adjective that could possibly be, and noun, and verb. So liberties have to be taken, and this is also translation, so not every word is going to fully be exactly as it was originally written in. And sometimes, we got to get a bit create. There was a little bit of creativity taken with the translation in the original text in order to keep that alliteration going. So, like, I looked it up because I was kind of confused because every now and again, Gawain would become Wayne. And at the very first part of the book, when they were still in Camelot, I thought that Wayne was his father, was a brother of King Arthur. I then found out that they just changed Sir Gawain's name to Wayne in order to keep the alliteration going. And there's multiple versions of his name, regardless, that have been written throughout history in multiple works. And names change over time. I've heard people say Gawain as well and Gawan instead of Gawain. I say Gawain just because I'm saying it phonetically and I like the way it sounds. But uh, it's very enjoyable to read. And then also going off with the beginning of the poem, since I read it in general. I very much enjoy that it doesn't actually start out in Camelot. It starts out with a little bit of prehistory about how we got to where we are. Uh, you know, talking, it immediately draws a parallel to, um, what is it? The end of the Iliad or the beginning of the Odyssey. I believe Troy is fully sacked or and sieged with the horse at the end at the beginning of the Odyssey, not the end of the Iliad. Don't quote me on that though. I haven't read either. But I do know generally what happens in both of those, and I'd like to make an interesting comparison, and I believe could be maybe a reason why the poem starts out this way. because we're immediately drawing these parallels to these ancient Greek epics, and in specific with the Odyssey, which, like I said, I believe that's where the salt ended at Troy, at the beginning of the Odyssey. And the Odyssey is Odysseus's journey back home to Ithaca. Um, I believe you could draw a lot of parallels between Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Odysseus, because Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, it is the journey of Gawain heading off to find the Green Chapel and find the Green Knight in order to uphold his chivalry and keep the agreement that he made with the Green Knight. And it's quite a journey. And at the very end, there's the journey back, and Gawain Poet actually writes that he went on many a quest and many an adventure on his way back to Camelot, but that's not what we're writing about. We're writing about him going for this specific event, coming back, and then, the reaction of everybody when he gets back to Camelot, because, that's what they're all wondering. Is not what you did to get there. It's like, oh, what did you do when you got there? How are you alive? Because obviously what happens at the beginning of the Green Knight is that Gawain kind of missteps, and he goes a little overboard with the punishment for the Green Knight's transgressions and comments. And instead of just nicking him or something, he full outright just beheads him. Not expecting him to get back up, to be fair, but might be a slight overreaction on his part, but just a slight overreaction on his part. But it really sets the tone for what's going to happen, I think. And it makes the journey all that much better. But what I meant when I said that you can draw some parallels between the Odyssey and Sir Gawain's journey to the Green Chapel and everything is how in the Odyssey, Odysseus, he's trying to get back home to Ithaca, and he struggles a little bit. But then you have him, go on this crazy journey all across the Mediterranean to get back to his home, and he keeps his chivalry throughout all of it, or not chivalry in the sense how the British have it, in the Middle Ages Europe at the time, but it definitely was. I feel like it could be slightly reminiscent. I could be completely wrong about this, but those are just my initial thoughts. And actually, there's a lot more parallels between Sir Orfeo and the Odyssey that I could make. But the fact that they're in the same collection and they were in the same manuscript originally, definitely I could see giving some credence to that, because they're all quite short. You can read them all in a day. I mean, I read it over the course of 2 days, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight took up two of those, took up one and a half of those days, and Pearl and Sir Orfeo took up the last half of one of them because they're so short. Sir Orfeo is like 20 pages, like I said. But the journey there for Gawain to find the Green Knight was interesting on its own. It mentions he fights trolls and ogres and whatnot, and all these mythical creatures, and he goes to many a land that he does not even know the names of. They mention he goes to Wales at one point. But I really thought how it was interesting to see what the view of chivalry was in these days, and how sort of insane the events that go on is, or how insane the events that happen are. Because, he can't find the Green Knight for the longest time, and then he takes up sanctuary in this random castle that he finds, and then the guy's like, oh, well, the Green Knight's right over there, so you can just stay here in the meantime, and we'll play a game. I'll go out and hunt something, and you can have it, and anything that you get in the castle, you give to me. It's a gentleman's agreement, and it's, as we find out, a complete test of chivalry by one Morgan Le Fay, who is a enchantress. She's learned in the ways of Merlin's magic. I think it mentions at the end of the poem. But it was really interesting to find that out at the end, because that's not what I was expecting at all. I did not know very much about the Green Knight going into it at all, and that was definitely not the direction I thought it was going in. I also thought that the Gawain was going to die, or the ending was going to be left ambiguous, and it was not. Maybe that's just me thinking it was going to be very similar to the A24 movie when it really wasn't. The movie's, not a one-to-one adaptation, but very good in its own right. Very strange, but it was good in its own right. I would probably enjoy it more now than I did back then. Um, but I really liked the whole, test of chivalry. It's like he's got this woman that's basically just, clawing to get at him. And she keeps kissing with him, flirting him, and, he has to kiss the guy every night to be like, oh, well, I got a kiss while I was here, so you can get that. And he doesn't tell him where he gets it because that'd be messed up. And then he continues forward and it keeps happening. And then, she really makes her move and is just, in his room naked when he wakes up, trying to almost force herself on him. And he's like, I just can't. Like, that's messed up. You're somebody else's husband. I'm not besmirching my honor. Um, and, she's quite upset and she makes a whole trifle about it. And he is so magnanimous and nice that he even tries to, dissuade her from it. And, even when he has to really put her down and set his foot down, like, no, I'm not, this isn't happening. He still tries to, make amends with her and is like, well, we're still friends. We don't got to be, enemies just because I'm not going to cheat on your husband with you and, and besmirch my honor and chivalry. And, part of that is him, trying to be, as nice as possible to her and keep her happy. And he ends up doing it in a way that still kind of besmirches his honor. And I think it's cool because it shows that Gawain is very human, even though he is chivalrous. And I think it's one of the cool things about it because I really thought going into this that this was going to be like a tried and true, like a man who does no wrong kind of attitude. But Gawain has flaws, he's not perfect. And I really did not expect that going into this. I thought this was really going to be Gawain's the most perfect man that could ever be, chivalry incarnate, just like King Arthur and all those of the Round Table, and there's no wrong that he could do. But that's not what it was, and he did do a little bit of wrong. Um, but what I liked so much about this and about the ending specifically is that when everything comes to light and, the Green Knight misses his stroke, I think on purpose. Um, um, it comes to light that, he took her girdle and was wearing it, which was supposed to keep him safe. And the guy's kind of like, well, that's, kind of underhanded, a bit cowardly. You took my wife's girdle. It's messed up. Um, and he's like, you know what it was, but don't speak these ill words of me because you guys played me for a fool. And then he's like, oh, that's true. That's true. But you are a man of honor and you can't blame a man for just wanting to live, He didn't want to die. And I mean, I thought that was one of my favorite parts of it is that at the end, I really thought it was just going to be either like a real black and white situation. The guy's like, well, no, it makes sense that you're going to want to live. I mean, I don't blame you. I mean, the fact that you even came here is proof enough that you are an honorable man. Um, and he's so impressed by him that he's like, please come stay in the castle longer so that we can revel on Christmas, Christmas Eve or Christmas tide or something like that. And Gawain is just like, I just can't. I gotta go home. You guys tricked me. I don't want to be here any longer. And he's like, fair enough. Well, fare thee well, Sir Gawain. And they had a lot of respect for one another at the end. And that was really just such a great way to end that particular part of this story. And I really like when he gets back, how it's almost just kind of like a joke. He has to tell them what happens and he doesn't change any of the truth even if it makes them look bad at times. And they're all just laughing and they think it's just funny as hell that this is what happened. And they're just happy that Gawain's alive. And I think that that was a really nice ending to the poem. And it also ends with a specific line. This version. Um, it kind of comes full cyclical where it goes. The ending, I'm skipping a lot of the stanza, but it goes, thus in Arthur his days happen this marvel, as the book of the Brut beareth us witness, since Brutus the bold knight to Britain came first, after the siege and assault had ceased at Troy, I trow. Many a marvel such before has happened here ere now. To his bliss us bring who bore the crown of thorns on brow. Amen. and then it has a little quote that I don't know if was in the original text, but it is read as, I'm going to butcher this, honey soit qui malpens, which I looked up what it translates to, and it's written a little differently in this translation. It's written, I think, phonetically, whereas normally it's written with an I, not a Y, in hoit or hoiti. But I read it, and I forget the exact translation, but it was an idiom or a metaphor or saying um, that essentially meant that a person who sees evil in a situation, them seeing that evil says more about them than it does about the situation itself. Or if you only see the bad in something, that really says more about you than the situation being bad. Um, which I think is, a pretty apt way of ending it because, Gawain was looking at this situation and, at the end he's getting beat red in the face because he's so embarrassed by everything that happened. And, he's looking more on, the bad that happened in the situation. But in the end, it was a test of his chivalry that he passed. He was given a little bit of forgiveness and it was more of a very human moment at the end, which I think, is really good to have in your fantasy, really human moments. One of the best things about fantasy is that it can really show you some very human things because it can really accentuate those to the extreme a lot of times. And this technically could happen. I guess two people could. Some random guy, with grass clippings in his beard could come up to you and be like, "Hey, let's play this game." And he besmirches everybody's honor in your house, and you're like, "Oh well, strike me, and I'll give you the same strike a year and 1 day from now." And then you bet. Well, I guess you couldn't behead him. No, that's not going to happen. But you could lop his arm off, and he's, you think he's not going to be come back or like make you come back, and he's like, "All right, well, I'll see you in a year and a half, and I'm cutting your other arm off." Um, but I like how such an extreme situation that really only does happen in fantastical moments is used to show these really human emotions and concepts and natures. I really enjoy it. Pearl, I don't have a lot to say on Pearl. It was enjoyable to read the actual poeticness of the stanzas themselves. Reading it. I'm not going to call it prose since that's not what it is. It was very nice and it's different. It doesn't have the bob and wheel. It's written with rhymes every other line. Like the first line ends in please and the third line ends in sees. Second line is clear, fourth line is peer. Um, I really enjoyed the first line of this actually, the first four lines, so I'm gonna read them. Pearl of delight that a prince doth please, to grace in gold and close so clear. I vow that from over orient seas never proved I any in price her peer. Um, it was honestly a really sad poem, and I remember I don't know if it was in the introduction or something in this book written about it, or if it was something I read online, but I heard that there's like two debates on what the poem is really about. One of them is that it's dealing about a father's daughter dying, which is really morbid and very, very sad, but it also kind of has a happy connotation in the ending with everything that occurs during the poem. And then the other is that it's supposed to be analogous for something religious that I didn't understand. Um, I take it more as the former, just because that's what I understand better. And I also think that it is very sad and it makes it more impactful. Um, because if it is about a man losing his daughter, it's so incredibly sad because, it's presented as this man who has a opulent, perfect pearl, loses it in a garden, and then he trips in the garden and, his soul leaves his body, he dies. Maybe he's, so distraught that he, um, you know, commits suicide or something like that, or that he can't go on living. It's more a metaphor that he cannot go on living without his daughter, and that's how heart-stricken he is. And, he goes to what appears to be heaven or the gates outside of New Jerusalem, as they call it in this. And it really had a light tone to it, as heavy as it was, and it had a lot of theological stuff in it, I believe, where it's more talking about the nature of what happens after you die, what heaven is like, who's going to go to heaven, who's not, and a lot of it was basically the guy was somebody telling the narrator that he is too obsessed with what's going on and he's not looking past his grief to see that the pearl is in a good place. And I thought that that was very nice. Um, I thought the ending was very interesting. How it turns out that the girl he thought was his pearl was not actually, and that was part of like, oh, you don't even recognize your own pearl, in this afterlife, area, which was kind of sad. But I thought it ended on a happy note with him realizing that his pearl is happy. She's jubilous. She's sitting next to her lord. And he just gets cast away at the very last moment when he tries to reach her because it's not quite his time yet, and he has to go on living. And even if she is a pearl that doth please Prince so kindly, I've already forgotten the first line. Um, she is in a good place, and that he can be happy knowing that. And I thought that that was really nice. It was sweet. It was. I was happy I read it. It was good. I don't have much more to say on it than that. I'm not too versed in the ways of theology or anything like that or Christianity. But to get on with Sir Orfeo, that was a poem I really enjoyed, and I thought it was such an interesting story. It's got that Fey aspects to it, and he mentions, the King of Fairies, and I believe Shakespeare called the King of Fairies Oberon. Um, if I'm not mistaken. So that's what came to my mind. But the whole concept of the poem I thought was really cool. It's just guy sitting there, his wife has a dream, and then gets harried off and carried off to a mystical realm, and he's so unbelievable. He tries to protect her and he can't. And he's so unbelievably heart-stricken by it that he can't be with his wife anymore. And then he's like, all right, I'm gonna go live in the woods in my sorrow and just play my beautiful lute. And seeing all of his retainers just so sad and his steward, and they're just like, please don't leave, please, please be safe, all this stuff. And then, 10 years later, he's this hobo living in the woods who still plays beautiful music. And he eventually is able to find his wife. And he kind of plays a trick on the King of Fairies in a very, maybe not chivalrous way, but a very clever way, where, he disguises himself as that poor, bedraggled, minstrel, and he plays for the king, and he makes a and the at first the king is like, oh well, I could command anybody that I want to come here, and the fact that you're doing this on your own is just weird. You shouldn't be doing that. And then he's like, oh well, how about you listen to me first, and then we'll see. And I promise you, it's going to be some of the best things you've ever heard. And that's part of the prowess of Sir Orfeo. He's a good king. He's a good lute player. He's probably a good fighter. He's smart, as we know from the what transgresses throughout the poem. But I really enjoyed how he got his wife back with that little trick, and it kind of reminded me of some Greek myth. I'm pretty sure that I read it online. I don't know if it's true, but I heard that it's kind of like a British retelling of Orpheus from Greek mythology. And I believe Orpheus went to Tartarus to get his wife back, from Hades, and Hades was convinced by his wife to do so. I think, or maybe that's something else that I read. But I thought it was really cool how he gets his wife back, and then um, going back with that whole Greek idea, parallels to the Odyssey that I drew. He goes back, and at first he carries his wife back, and he sets her by the tree that she had originally fallen asleep by, and he's like, I'm gonna do a little test real quick since I've been gone so long. And he goes back to his steward and he's like, please, can I just stay here for a little bit? Can you shelter me, food me, all this stuff? Give me food. Um, and they're like, of course, of course. I'm ruling for Sir Orfeo, my poor king who's no longer here and who's hopefully alive. And we'll do all these things for you because that's what he would have done. And he was a great leader, and we want to make him proud and do what he would have done. And how Sir Orfeo is immediately just like, oh, well, I'm sure that your king, uh, would be great. Would love this stuff. And he plays his lute, and the guy's like, oh, well, where'd you get that lute? Because that's my king's. And he's like, oh, I found it by a corpse. And that was the final test. It's like, all right, now that he knows his king is never coming back, what's his real demeanor going to be like? Is he going to kick me out? Is he going to, just proclaim to the heavens that he's the new ruler and he's all powerful and he's going to be a tyrant? And no, that's not what he does. He weeps that his king is dead. And Sir Orfeo responds by, revealing that it is him and that his king never died and that he's extraordinarily happy with the people that he left his kingdom. And he's just absolutely is not astounded, but just proud of his men that this is the way that they are. It's not just because of him, it's just how they are. Whether he rubbed off on them or that's just how they were, I believe it's supposed to be more that's how they are. And I think it's great. And it shows also how the kind of man that Sir Orfeo is supposed to be. Um, and then happily, it's kind of a happily ever after kind of story by the end. And the final lines go, "Thus came Sir Orfeo out of care. God grant that well we all may fare." And, like I said, there's a little bit of, religious connotations with all of these. But I really enjoyed all three of these poems, and I'm very glad that I read them. I'm probably going to make another video on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight going a little more in depth on some specific lines because I really did enjoy that poem, and I might do another one on Sir Orfeo. But for now, those are just some of my thoughts on J.R.R. Tolkien's translations, edited by Christopher Tolkien, his son. It was absolutely phenomenal. It's a great translation. Got to give props to them as well for translating it so well. There's one final thing. There was also this is the appendix on the verse forms. There's a final poem called Gawain's Leave Taking, which is kind of like a way of wrapping it all up, where it's more just this is how it leaves, this is how it ends. And I thought it was a good way to wrap it up. I mean, it's pretty simple. I mean, there were some really good lines in that, like "Out of this world, death will us reave, and when we brought our beer against our will, we take our leave. Now, good day to you, good men all, and good day to you, young and old, and good day to you, great and small, and gramercy 1,000-fold. If aught there were that dear ye hold, full fain I would the deed achieve. Now Christ you keep from sorrows cold, for now at last I take my leave." And now at last, I take my leave. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching. If you made it all the way through this. If you haven't read these, I highly implore you to. If you're not very versed in Arthurian myth, I mean, I'm not really either. I just have an interest in it. You could definitely start with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, I think, because I enjoyed it. Um, but that's about all I have to say about those for now. I hope that you enjoyed the video, and I hope that you have a good day.